Hello and welcome everyone to this wonderful ASAA conference 2022. We are really thrilled to have so many of you in the room here today. I'm Mridula Nath Chakrabarti and I'll be chairing this plenary session for the conference theme Social Justice in Pandemic Times. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on here today. For Monash, it's the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the care and nurture with which they've held the land in traditional custodianship for us. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands from which so many of us here are meeting. The session here today features three stellar speakers, Dr. Noor Huda Ismail, Dr. Sukhmani Khurana, and Dr. Irwin Charles B. Kawal-Kinto. Our first speaker today here is Noor Huda Ismail, who unfortunately could not join us in person, but is connecting to us from Singapore via Zoom. Noor is a hybrid of an insider, social entrepreneur, filmmaker, and scholar. He won British Chevening Scholarship to further his master's degree at St. Andrews University, Scotland. After finishing his PhD on the Indonesian foreign fighters, hegemonic masculinity, and globalization at Monash University on Australian Award, he's now doing his fellowship at RSIS NTU Singapore. His community website has recently won an intercultural award from Austria. Over to you, Noor, for your paper, Alternative Ways of Countering Violence Extremism, CVE, in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this super important conference, but in the same time also I'm very sad that I cannot make it. Here I don't make any PowerPoint presentations, but I want to make read a paper that I have been working on. Because I'm going to talk about alternative ways of countering violent extremism in Indonesia based on my personal experience, reflection, and I try to combine with existing literature talking in this very issue. There exists a widespread opinion within the Indonesian society that former members of local terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Inspire Jamaah Islamiyah, and groups that support the Islamic State, such as Jamaah Ansaruddaullah, should be treated as a dangerous and lunatic individual who do not deserve a second chance to reintegrate back peacefully into mainstream society. In addition, a lack of knowledge on the complex issue of radicalism and terrorism, coupled with out-of-proportion coverage of terrorist incidents in the media, could also erode social trust in a state that encourages reintegration of former members of terrorist groups. However, denying former members of terrorist groups, particularly those who have been convicted and served their sentences, I call it an ex-extremist, as a second chance to reintegrate into society through extensive rehabilitation is counterproductive. Instead of curbing terrorism within society, pursuing a severe and one-size-fits-all approach without room for rehabilitation might well have the opposite effect of leading to a rebound in recruitment into terrorist organizations. Like members of terrorist groups often face social hostility and harassment in a public space as well as an online space. In some cases, families of ex-terrorists isolate themselves from their larger community due to the embarrassment and fear of harassment. In this context, the choice for an ex-member is stuck, return to the path of terrorism, or to re-enter to society that is hostile to them. If he or she lives in a difficult social and economic situation, the lack of societal support might likely drive the ex-member back to their former extremist communities, where he or she will feel protected and cared for. How can the state and civil society strike the balance between retaining social trust of effectiveness of its counter-extremism measures and reintegrating ex-members into society? Addressing this question is critical. For one, there is the possibility of release of hundreds of convicted terrorists and perhaps also pro-ISIS returnee from Syria in the immediate future. Academic research has theoretized the process through and the reason for which members of society in Indonesia and elsewhere join violent extremist groups such as JI, ISIS, and JAD, as well as living violent groups, Forum 2012, Horgan 2018, and many more. However, there is a dearth of empirical research on the process of rehabilitation of members into society once they leave violent group. The militant struggle for national Islamic State in Indonesia date back to the 1940s when Darul Islam fought its independence. In the 1950s, when Darul Islam influence was at the height, the Ottomans were reputed to have controlled vast swathes of Aceh, South Sulawesi, and West Java. Although DI was neutralized in 1960, its offshoots and splinters, which included Jamaah Islamiyah, have continued to struggle to this day. As a result, Indonesia has experienced a series of deadly terrorist attacks since the early 2000s, including the Bali bombing in 2002, which killed 202 people. The idea of establishing Islamic State is still prevalent within Indonesian society. A Minister of Defense study revealed that 23% of high school and university students in Indonesia agree with the idea of Islamic State or Caliphate for Indonesia. This deep root have been bolstered by a more recent arrival of hardline Salafi ideas from the Middle East. These ideas have challenged and undermined syncretic indigenous practices that have long contributed to the development of a pluralistic culture and religious tolerance in Indonesia. The speed, the accessibility, and decentralized nature of the internet enlarges the potential audience of extremist propaganda. Using a qualitative research method, this paper contributes to the debate around social reintegration of ex-members of terrorist organizations. Social reintegration is indicated by the safe transition of the ex-member into larger community, during which the ex-member as well as the community alter their attitude and behavior. The paper proposed the triple H approach, heart, hand, and head approach, involving the government, community leaders, civil society organizations, and even private sector as a way to reintegrate ex-members. The paper then demonstrated that the triple H approach through empirical reading of a personal experience in spearheading the reintegration of members. An outline of the triple H approach. The hard facet of the triple H approach signifies the importance of empathy in earning the trust of an ex-member. This facet focuses on the physical and emotional well-being of ex-member as one of the key goals of reintegrations. The hand facet of the triple H approach signifies the importance of providing useful skills that will enable ex-member to hold steady jobs, start small business, often in collaboration with other members of the society. The goal is to enable ex-member to lead financially independent, purposeful lives. The final facet of the triple O approach had signify the process of revisiting one's old belief system and having the courage to challenge them. It encompasses a mix of logical and emotional components through which all belief systems that center around extremist ideology are replaced with new belief systems centered around pluralism. Adopting from Villarosa and Huang 2012, the head facet including three key elements: delegitimizing violence, disapproving the justification for violence, and offering positive constructive alternative. The Triple H approach combines narrative interventions using the power of storytelling to encourage reflection and engagement with a different perspective. The Triple H approach is unique in that it makes extensive use of ex-members who have been reintegrated and reformed as a tool in the reintegration process of other members, as well as to dissuade new recruits. This reformed ex-member acts as a role model for others to emulate, Bandura 1999. Their role in dissuading the recruit is crucial because violent extremist groups have been exploring the narrative of actual perceived grievances to gain support and new recruit. The narrative of credible voice can help potential recruit to make sense of their reality, fulfill the need for significance and meaning, Krukansky 2014. Thus, this approach sparked a constant cycle of reintegration and discussion. My interest in this issue has been a personal one. The Bali bombing in 2002 was a turning point in my life. I was working as a special correspondent for the Washington Post, covering the attack that killed more than 202 people, mostly foreigners. I quickly learned from one of police press conferences that Fadullah Hassan, my roommate, when I studied in Islamic boarding school in Solo, Central Java for 6 years in early 1980s, was one of the bombers. Since that day, the question of why a smart, soft-spoken, polite man like Hassan would become involved in terrorism has been a very personal one for me. In pursuing this question, I interviewed hundreds of convicted terrorists inside Indonesia's criminal justice system and visited some of their military camps in Ambon and Poso, two areas that were affected by communal conflict after the collapse of Suharto regime in 1980s and the southern Philippines. I won a British evening scholarship to further my master's degree in international security at St Andrews University, Scotland from 2005 to 2006. During that period, I conducted fieldwork in Northern Ireland, seeking to understand the conflict there. After meeting with a local NGO that has been trying to reintegrate former terrorists to integrate with society, I had an epiphany. If this NGO can do it, I can do it in my country once I return. The personal quest and historical connection to the network of militant in Indonesia has been essential in leading me to establish the Institute for International Peace Building in 2008. Through this institute, I embarked on a series of controversial social interventions to help former convicted terrorists to integrate back to society, then creatively to engage them in a peace narrative interventions. The call to give those released terrorists a second chance to start new life was not easy. For those who suffer the pain of terrorism directly, such as the victim and their family, rehabilitation of ex-members will be controversial and even offensive. In addition, the issue of terrorism in Indonesia is often still viewed by some segments of Muslim community as the West's systematic effort to corner Islam. From the societal perspective, counterterrorism is still considered the sole responsibility of the state. Therefore, unlimited rule is perceived for society in counterterrorism. Stemming from empirical readings of my personal experiences in reintegration, this paper demonstrates the critical role of civil society in counterterrorism through reintegration and rehabilitation of weak members. In doing so, it also highlights the role of narrative format intervention, which I have used and I have seen being used due to the effectiveness in reducing resistance to attempt of persuasion. Murray and Brewer in 2019. The succeeding section detailed implementation of the AAA approach vis-a-vis individual ex-member. The next section detailed the implementation of the AAA approach through a community workshop and community-based online platform. Now I'm going to talk an example of the implementation of the AAA approach, how I implement after highlighting the existing problem in Indonesian terrorism issue, and also my personal experience used to be part of this network myself. Now I propose three approaches with this heart, hand, and head. Now I'm going to talk about how I implement this. This section illustrates the practical implementation of the AAA approach through empirical readings of my personal examples of intervention. It is divided into three parts, compounding the three facets of the AAA approach: heart, hands, and head. The empirical example used in this section is that one of my first clients, I use the term client to underscore that I use the case management approach, Farihin Kandai, an Afghan veteran who fought with Osama bin Laden in the mid-1980s and then went back Indonesia in 1990s. Farihin's story is special because he comes from a blue blood of family involved in terrorism since many generations, Sedgman 2014. He told me that his uncle was involved in the attempt to kill the first Indonesian president in 1950s. It was through this connection of kinship that He too was selected to participate in military training in 1980s. One of his younger brother were also involved in terrorism in the country, including the bombing at the Philippine Ambassador House in Jakarta in the late 1990s, the Atrium Mall bombing in 2000, and church burning during communal conflict in Poso and Central Sulawesi in 2000s. In a nutshell, terrorism is Farihin's family business. With a background as an Afghan veteran in 1980s, he earned social respect within a specific community of JI. Heroic stories of those already performed jihad, like Farihin, is an important product of a jihad subculture. It facilitates, encourages, celebrates, supports, publicizes their excellence through the artifact and narrative circulated through global media, culture, and technology. He left the JI network after witnessing the hypocrisy of some JI leaders. They told me, JI member, and this leader, JI leader, he said, they told JI member in internal meetings and sermon for not cooperating with the authority, but privately I know that they also asked the help from them that include taking financial support, Farhin explained. Know the hard part. Hard refer to the earning trust from the ex-member through a display of empathy and authenticity. To earn Farhin trust, I had to first convince him of the genuineness of my interest in understanding his background and his drives. At the same time, I was honest about my personal background as a graduate of a JI school in Central Java, who later renounced his ideology, worked for the US media, and then pursued further education in the UK and Australia. While by no means an easy task, this is a critical first step in gaining his trust. Without understanding the ex-member level of engagement in terrorism, the community cannot help integrate peacefully into community. Earning his trust was made easier partly because I knew him through my work as a journalist for the Washington Post in 2002. We made a quick connection once he told me that his wife is also a graduate of the boarding school that I also attended, Al Mu'min Gruki Solo. After earning his trust, I was able to ask Farihin questions about what it was like to live inside a violent group like JI. He said, being part of the terrorist group was an about adventurous journey. I feel like I was part of something bigger than myself when I was with JI and Al-Qaeda. Hambali always told me that we want to change the corrupt secular system in the book. Through his connection with Hambali, an Afghan veteran from West Java who later joined Al-Qaeda, Farhin's involvement in terrorism gave him a greater meaning and purpose. He spoke with confidence and authority. His remark, okay, I have a 3 minute now. Okay, now I'm good. So basically, through Farhin, I earned this trust. And then after that, with the hand. With the hand of the Farhin, I tried to help him to find a meaning in life by helping him to start new life. And with head meaning, and with the heart, interestingly, even though Farihin was involved, I helped him to start new life. But in the head position was, he revisited his all understanding, even though he no longer interested in he was not involved in any terrorism activity, but he started to revisit his ideology. Then I sat down with him in one of the mosques where a number of ISIS supporters speaking, and he told me that he doesn't like ISIS, he doesn't agree with that, and because of that positions, and then the Indonesian government used him to challenge ISIS ideology and start to speak before television. But I started to learn that speaking before television, he kept glorifying his position in JI as a Afghan veteran. Then I came up, okay, this guy has an idea of challenging his old idea, but he needs to training. Then I organized a CVE training, a training of the convicted terrorists, those who reform from violence, combined with a number of community experts. I train them how to speak public speakings, and then after that we collect them through after that workshop, and then we organize. I connect them through WhatsApp group, and we establish a community website called Ruang Ngobrol. So basically, I have been amplifying the role of a credible voice of former to start challenging the old group. As being mentioned previously by our moderator, that I'm also a filmmaker. I produced a documentary about those individuals. The tagline of my work, I call it in Indonesia, bercerita tanpa menggurui. I'm telling story, I'm telling their story, not trying to what you call it to challenge them directly. So using that, so using amplifying the rules of credible voice through that website, and there is a chat room. So to my surprise, many people started to use my website to talk, to connect, and it is and including Indonesians who are known in Syria, at least around 60. We identified through this there's a chat room community, because through that website people can connect in each other. So I think that the conclusion, I'm going to read very fast here. A key factor that contribute to the section of the program and the Triple H approach in general is the effective utilization of former members of terrorist group. As a trainee themselves, their voice has a high credibility and important to gain the initial trust of the participants. The story of the former and the role of workshop were published in widely circulated book. Menanti yang kembali, waiting for the return. The book could potentially be used as a means of replicating this workshop in part of the Indonesia. To further the impact of this workshop, a documentary film titled The Mentor will also released. The film will act as a tool to enable outreach for different stakeholders. So my program, I'm not only interested in individual change, but I'm interested in systematic change within the system, but in the same time engaging scholar work in terms of knowledge productions. Thank you very much, and I hope we can have a more robust discussion during question and answers. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Noor. We'll definitely have ample time for questions later on. For the moment, we'll continue with the speakers. So please hold on to your questions for Noor, which we'll return to towards the end of this session. Our next speaker is Sukmani Khurana. Dr. Khurana is the Vice Chancellor's Senior Research Fellow at the Young and Resilient Research Center at Western Sydney University. And for those of our participants who are not from Australia, will probably be heartened to know that Western Sydney is one of the most multicultural and diverse areas of Australia, and certainly a kind of mirror of Asian society to a certain extent. Previously, Dr. Khurana was a senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Wollongong. She has published extensively on diasporic cultures, multi-platform refugee narratives, and the politics of empathy. Sukmani is the author of The Tastes and Politics of Intercultural Food in Australia and has a forthcoming book on the mediated emotions of migration, which came out from Bristol University, which is due to come out from Bristol University in 2022. And Sukmani will talk about called communities during COVID, amplification of intersectional vulnerabilities. Over to you, Sukmani.
Thank you, Mridula. So what you see there on the slide is me doing fieldwork at Tamil Feast, and I was very sad and disappointed to find out that it is one of the casualties of the pandemic, which also relates to some of the themes that I'll be speaking to today. But before I begin, I would also like to say that I'm very grateful and privileged to be able to travel here from Western Sydney, the land of the Darug Baramatagal people, and be here at Monash Uni and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are on, which is the Kulin Nation. Now, I've been working on COVID-19 from a number of different angles, some of which are accidental and the others are just partnerships with other organizations and collaborators, including Dr. Ruth D'Souza from RMIT University. I'll be speaking to the first and the third project on that slide. The first one is this idea about affect and congestion, which I'd been working on prior to the pandemic, but obviously with the debates about congestion and density and social distancing, that became even more pertinent in the wake of the pandemic. And the second project I'll be speaking to is some research that our university has been doing with Settlement Services International, which those of you in Victoria may not be familiar with, because it's a settlement organization for refugees and has a number of humanitarian programs in lots of different areas, including how people settle into a new country, what services they need, especially in the first 5 years of their arrival. So this phase of the project, which was the third phase, looked at what happened during COVID, which is family separation and reunion. And the report is going to be launched in August, so this is the first kind of outing, and I'd be very keen to hear what people make of some of our findings. Before COVID, there was a lot of interest in, especially in outlying areas of Sydney and Melbourne, in this idea of overdevelopment, in this idea of congestion. But what I highlight in this paper, which was published in Cultural Studies, is that this was cast before COVID as a problem to do with the quality of the environment and quality of life and lifestyle. So there's some statements just before the previous election, which is the 2019 federal election, which was also when the last New South Wales state election took place. So the then Premier Gladys Berejiklian was making statements that she was concerned about overdevelopment because it was having an impact, she thought, on the quality of people's lives. Now, who was being centered in these stories was not necessarily the people who were inhabiting these so-called congested areas, which is essentially migrants, including migrants from Asian countries, as well as a lot of working class migrants. It was white settlers, white middle class settlers who were being centered in these debates. It was their congestion or their perception of congestion which was being highlighted. Other commentary at that time included former opposition leaders, which is on the Labour Party's side, talking about a white flight. Another comment from Luke Foley, who was also a previous opposition leader in the New South Wales Parliament, saying that he was unhappy about the fact that a lot of their kids were losing jobs to Asian PhDs. He obviously caught a lot of flack for that comment, and he had to later apologize. But I guess, again, what was being highlighted through all of this commentary was that the people experiencing congestion were not actually the people who were living in these suburbs. And this harks back again to commentary that has been taking place in Australia in a number of disciplines, including famously Ghassan Haj, who in White Nation talks about managerialism in the White Nation, where it's ethnic populations that are always managed, that are always the subjects of the White Nation, rather than the people who are making decisions about diversity. Melissa Butcher is another person from cultural geography who's written a little bit about the management of congestion is usually about the management of diversity, even though it's not couched in those terms. So that was pre-COVID. What happened post-COVID? And by post-COVID, I don't mean COVID is over, of course, seeing all these masks in the room. And by post-COVID, I'm essentially saying what I mean, what everyone means by post-colonial, in that it is ongoing. In terms of what happened since the outbreak of COVID, I'm arguing that it's been an amplification of inequalities that already existed to some extent before COVID. But the difference was that instead of congestion being cast as a lifestyle or an environmental issue, it became an economic issue or an employment issue, but again with the white middle class subject and Australian jobs at the centre. So Christina Kennelly famously also said right after the COVID outbreak in 2020 that this was an opportune moment to have a debate about the migration numbers in this country, who gets to come, what kinds of skills they have. So the economic rationale became center stage in the wake of COVID. But it's also important to point out that has changed slightly now when we have shortages in a number of industry. But again, migrants are being instrumentalized as people who fill skills gaps rather than people who were actually quite disadvantaged by the pandemic, because Australia was one of the few OECD countries that didn't provide any kind of payments to temporary visa holders like people on work visas, as well as a number of international students. So the approach I've used in this article is essentially mobilizing affect for mobility justice. And I am looking at a number of scholars like the Untokening Network, which is saying that this has happened across the world. It's happened with BIPOC workers in the UK, in the US, across the global north. But the lessons we need to learn from this is that our racialized communities, which also happen to be people who are essential workers, including the people who were locked down in the 9 towers in North Melbourne and Flemington in 2020, those people's lives should be sacred and not sacrificial in the midst of what has just taken place. And the changes that we need to bring about are not in terms of evaluating the quantity and quality of migration, but in fact having a justice approach at the center of the way we think about migration. So on that note of justice, I'd like to move on to the second project that I've been working on with Settlement Services International, which is part of a big project called Foundations for Belonging. So this is the 2022 phase. And it focuses, as I mentioned earlier, on family separation and reunion during the pandemic. So I know, I'm aware that many families that have kith and kin overseas were affected by Australia closing down its international borders. But what has not been in the media and political discourse strongly enough is the way in which recently resettled refugees were impacted by these border closures. So to give you the big picture, the UNHCR has a particular target for the number of people that are resettled globally. And from 2020 onwards, there was a big drop. This is only 1/3 of the usual number that's usually resettled. So this is a global phenomena with particular ramifications in the Australian context. From March 2020, the Australian government also decided to slash its intake, which is already low when you compare it to many other OECD countries. So it was slashed further from about 18,000 to about 13,000 places. And then they started reopening gradually from December 2021. Now, even before the pandemic, family separation and reunion is an important issue in refugee communities. The only pathway for you to be reunited with your family, which is not your spouse and your immediate children, which is the definition of the nuclear family that Australia uses. So if you've got other kinds of family, which is not your immediate offspring or your spouse, which is de facto or married, it is very difficult for them to be reunited. And many organizations have obviously been advocating for this definition of the family to be changed. Now, this particular program, the Special Humanitarian Program, does allow you to sponsor a relative, and this includes, paying for their airfare, legal and settlement support if they classify as a refugee or someone who needs protection. But the demand for this visa far outstrips the number of places that we have available, and there's precedents elsewhere, like in Canada, which we are starting to advocate for to make it a little bit better. Something that also came out in the research, which is not in the slide, is that the people who are sponsored on these visas, which is the 202 category, are doing much better in terms of their settlement and feelings of belonging in Australia, simply because they have family in Australia, as opposed to the people who are not on a 202 visa or who don't have family in Australia. So one of these examples is we had a big survey, but I'm just sharing with you one of the examples from the 7 family interviews that we did. Zoran, who is from a Kurdish family and lives with his 2 siblings in regional New South Wales. So they've been trying very hard for their parents to be reunited with them, but the applications have been stuck in the system, and it's been particularly hard for this family because they've been studying, so they don't have any income support apart from whatever little they get because they're still in school. But there's also a great deal of distress and worry about the family that is back home that doesn't have medical support, and there is no hope so far, even after the reopening of borders, in terms of when the application will be processed. So this is one example, and the other examples we had, ranged from people who had elderly relatives who were stuck in countries like Afghanistan, which had not just the pandemic, but also what happened in the case of the 2021 evacuation of Kabul. Like this particular couple, which was very reliant on communications with their family back in Afghanistan, but that was disrupted because telephone lines and the internet were disrupted after Kabul was captured by the Taliban. All of the families in our sample were using the internet more during the pandemic, not just for homeschooling, but also for staying in touch with their relatives. There was a lot of exchange of COVID-related information, medical information from Australian context to the countries that they were communicating in. But most broadly speaking, in terms of digital inclusion, a lot of the digital tools were being used to communicate, use video streaming platforms, but they were not necessarily being used for commercial and government services, which is partly about skills in particular cohorts like older women, but also it's about how these services have not been designed to be simple to use for our resettled refugee communities, in addition to not being in the languages that are accessible for them. I'm going to end my presentation here, but I'd be very happy to answer questions about either of these projects. I've just done very quick overviews to be able to give you a peek into some of my COVID-related research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sukhmani, for that impeccably timed presentation. You've given us a lot of food for thought, but also continued along some of the issues or points that Noor mentioned in terms of a politics of empathy, in terms of inclusion. We will hold questions for Sukhmani as well towards the end, but now we go on to Erwin Charles Cavalquinto, who is a lecturer in communication at Deakin University here in Narm. He's also a member of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Erwin is an honorary visiting fellow in the Humanities Research Centre at the Australian National University and also the author of Immobile Homes, Family Life at a Distance in the Age of Mobile Media, part of the Studies in Mobile Communication series of Oxford University Press. His current project examines the experiences and consequences of digital divide among aging migrants in Australia through critical mobility perspective. His research lies on the intersections of digital media, mobilities, and migrations. Over to you, Erwin.
Thank you very much, Miradula, and good afternoon, everyone, for inviting me and for having me to today's conference. And I'm very privileged and very honored to actually talk about the conceptual lens that I've been developing for the past years in terms of thinking about who can actually move or not move in the digital world. And today's presentation, I'll be focusing on the lives of aging migrants as my case study, but more importantly, really thinking about the paradoxes in the space of the home. And just a warning, I'll be using Lego to visualize all of my storytelling as part of my narrative, but also the concepts that I'll be presenting in today's presentation. Okay, so in thinking about the work of mobilities and immobilities, I'm actually situating my study within the context of migration and digital media. And I'm looking at, particularly with this conversation happening in 2019, that there's a push of mobility bias, that we tend to look at the movements in a transnational and global world. But more importantly, we need to really unpack, like, what are the factors shaping the movements in those spaces in everyday lives, but also the factors creating immobilities. Hence, when I was actually approached by the organizer to start thinking about social justice, linking to Sukhmani's presentation a while ago, I started thinking about mobility justice, which is articulated by mobility scholar Mimi Scheller. And this is contextualized in the Western context and not in the Asia-Pacific context, yet that it's providing us a vantage point to start thinking about. So in terms of thinking about the mobilities paradigm in the transnational world, I'm actually situating this conversation within the new mobilities paradigm. And the main point of this paradigm is highlighting that people, goods, and services and information move across a distance. Like, for example, you are here, you might be connecting to other people by traveling, but later on, we discuss the digital media's role in facilitating those movements. But take note that movements are shaped by class, gender, age, disability, and even ethnicity. And that's creating what Creswell was suggesting, the politics of movements. that not all movements are the same and at ease and comfortable. So when we start thinking about mobilities, we should be really paying attention to immobilities. As you can see on my slide, there's this elderly person, and she's an aging migrant, which we'll be unpacking shortly as part of my articulation of movements. And over the past years, immobilities have already been discussed by scholars in the context of migration and geography, and the work of Carling, the work of Schiwell, and the work of Salazar. They're all articulating that we need to pay attention as well to immobility. And this was particularly highlighted during the pandemic, wherein a lot of us are actually immobilized in our homes. And that made me think in really reflecting upon who is able to move and not move in the domestic, network, and transnational space. And when we start thinking about the pandemic, we start looking at this politics of representation as well and the politics of movement. But that politics of movement is actually articulated in my own work through a digital lens. Over the past years, I've been looking at the case of transnational Filipino family connecting through digital communication technologies, but they're also immobilized in spaces, immobilized even in the digital space because of the lack of access, literacies, and even the networks. And when we start thinking about mobilities and immobilities in the digital context, I've been working with scholars in the field, for example, Chuliraki, yours, and a lot of scholars articulating that, for example, refugees in the camp, migrants in their homes, would be immobilized physically, but then being able to move virtually. But at the same time, in my thinking, they can actually be immobilized in the digital world if they do not have a stable internet connection, if they do not have the access, if they do not have the competencies in that space. I'm actually just making close because I'm trying to read my slide. Okay, so in thinking about mediated mobilities, I've been looking and theorizing about this notion for the past years, and we might be able to think about mobilities and mobilities through voluntary and involuntary dimensions. So when we start thinking about involuntary digital mobilities, this could be forced. You might be forced to send money, you might be forced to communicate to your parents back home, or you might be forced to enact that what we call filial piety in an Asian context to show express and love. But at the same time, it can be involuntary. That kind of, you don't want to send something because perhaps you don't want to affect the feeling or impact the feeling of that individual in that space. So hence, over the past years, really thinking about mediated mobilities, not only performed, negotiated, and we can feel it. We feel frustrated, we feel lonely, we feel sad, and we can feel immobility through the digital world. So in the context of conversations of mobilities, I'm looking at the home as a space to think about these conversations of the interconnectedness of movements and stasis in the digital world. And for me, the home, and you can reflect on this one as well, and based on my book, that the home is not only a geographically bound space, it is very transnational, it's very networked, but also political. When I'm looking at the case of the Philippines, the transnational home is produced by a labor exporting country like the Philippines and Indonesia. You know, we are sending migrants overseas. Now, the notion of home is becoming transnational and networked, yet our government is not addressing the digital connections that should be a human right at this point in time because we are connected globally. So it is that asymmetrical kind of like conditions that will be kind of like critical in that space. Going back to the pandemic, let us stay at home. That was the conversation. And during the pandemic, the immobility was actually centered. You are a responsible citizen if you stay at home and you use all of these digital technologies because you are not infecting anyone. You won't be affected. But at the same time, we have to step back and reflect. Immobility, true, for example, in that space, is actually hierarchical, political, and also overladen with power. Take, for example, the lives of the elite people who can actually enclave in that space where they're comfortable, while the hypermobile nurses, Uber drivers, they're at risk moving around. And then start thinking about the digital. Who has the connection to work from home and who has the capacity and the competencies, like for example with the older migrants that I interviewed, would be able to connect in that space, hence the politics. Okay, let's look at the discourses during the pandemic. We saw the New Yorker promoting digital media use for nurses to connect and to enact a sense of home, because a home is no longer a physical space, but very mobile, portable, and effective as well. And platforms were actually promoting, you can actually stay at home, be safe, connect with us, be with your family. And this is a discourse overlooking the conditions of people within the margins who are not able to actually move, do not have the access, skills, and competencies in that space. So you have all of these cute stickers. You probably did TikTok during the pandemic. You were dancing. Actually, one of my participants told me, Orvin, I'm actually TikToking. Oh, girl, go for it. So anyway, so when we think about the immobile lives of now the people around us, the margins, we start looking at the aging migrants, which I've been looking as a case study in 2020 and 2021. I did interviews remotely because we were in a lockdown in Victoria. And I interviewed 15 elderly people through through Zoom and also through a phone call. So I was doing that. And interestingly, in the context of Australia, we are heading towards an Asian-dominated aging population. And we need to take into that account in the way we start thinking about interventions, policies, and programs to ensure what Sukmani was saying a while ago, digital inclusion. Okay, I'll just go through with some of the data that I had for 2020 and 2021 and really thinking about the home as facilitated by connections, but also care practices. Because care, for example, in the Asian context, is integral to what we call filial piety, to be obedient to your family members, to respect the elderly, and stuff like that. But during the pandemic, 3 dimensions of staying connected. One is to care for oneself. So they were using technologies to establish that sense of calmness. Being physically immobile, but virtually mobile. And that virtual mobility is actually culturally informed in the sense that, for example, the quote from Luthika, he was actually chanting on YouTube and feeling a sense of calmness every night during the pandemic. And interestingly, I also had a conversation with Donna. I couldn't see, sorry. Donna. So Donna was actually the oldest in my participants. She was 96 years old, and she was using Facebook Messenger. So the son was teaching her to use Facebook Messenger even before the pandemic. So when the pandemic happened, she was connecting locally because we're not allowed to visit at the first part, initial part of the lockdowns. We're not allowed to visit people, and even at the latter part. So she couldn't see the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren. So they were using Facebook Messenger to exchange information and to exchange photos. But also, more importantly, for migrants connecting transnationally. And this is the case of Mabel. And Mabel, she was actually exchanging photos with the family members back in the Philippines. And they're using Facebook Messenger as well to connect. And actually, during the interviews, a lot of my Indonesian participants are telling me Telegram and WhatsApp. So it's different per migrant community. And also, more importantly, for example, connecting transnationally, the lives of older migrants, that they demonstrate that they're still alive and they're actually part of the community. So for example, the case of Dorothy, she was actually taking photos of the garden and sending photos of the garden to friends and to family members to tell them that I'm still alive, that I'm doing this, I'm busy. But see, that's the thing with physical immobility. You actually create your presence and mobility, virtual mobility, with the digital technology. But more importantly, for example, connecting transnationally may be able to connect to Edwin, sending money to Indonesia to pay the everyday expenses of the sister who wasn't working at that time. So these practices are actually form of care in that environment. But I'm also interested to think about what are the immobilities happening in the digital space in that context. And you might be start thinking about the layering of immobility. You have the physical, but then you also have the digital. And the digital could be a voluntary mediated immobilities. Someone might not be sending, like for example, Mali, not sending a photo of the food, because typically you take photos of your food, right? Okay, photo, and then send it to friends or family members. She wasn't doing that. And she told me, Irvin, I won't do that because if I send the photo to my family members in Cambodia, it's not good. I look rich to them. At the same time, I know that they're already suffering in Cambodia. They're already job losses. My family members, they didn't have the finances to buy. I don't want to do that. So again, it's a conversation and a negotiation actually when you start thinking about immobility. Not only immobility, but immobility. And more importantly, for example, the case of Edwin, he was forced to not connect to Indonesian family members. And the same with the Filipino participants. Access of electricity and the bill to actually pay the connection. And this is an important conversation when we start thinking about digital inclusion in Australia. That transnational perspective is important to start thinking about who is able to move in the digital space and who is not able to move in that world. And obviously, in thinking about the home and the practices of family members, I consider the home now as a very extractive digital immobile space wherein we become so transparent to platforms. They see what we're doing in the home because of the platforms that we use, the connections that we have. And they're promoting the use of staying safe, and now they have our data. But that's also interesting because immobility now, perceived through a capitalist lens, is actually a counter-narrative to profit-making. But they found a way to make us move in our home. And that's through the digital space. And that's extracting more data. And when they extract more data, we start thinking about how does a colonialist, racist, sexist regimes would be shaping those practices? And that's a conversation by mobility scholar Mimi Scheller on mobility justice. We need to identify those entry points and start thinking about inclusion. And then I reflect on who is actually constructing and how it is constructed when we start thinking about mediated mobilities. First things point, it's very relational. There is a negotiation on how we move and how we not move in the digital space. But more importantly, it's also a dimension of understanding the affect, the emotion. We connect, we make sure that we are able to please someone in that space or be happy in that space. But more importantly, let's zoom into the microspace of the home. Now we're able to move. But some people are still in their homes, excluded in this very now mobile world again because of the lack of resources. But more importantly, when we start moving towards the digital and mobile world, we start thinking about who has access, who has the competencies, who has the network to be able to connect that. And speaking of network, majority of my participants were learning to use technologies during the pandemic, during the lockdown, with their family members. I think this is an important point that we need to bring in the role of family members and even transnational networks in having a conversation on, for example, what platform should we be using to inform, for example, the Chinese community or the Filipino community or the Indonesian community. And that's where we kind of like start thinking about mobility justice, which Scheller was arguing, and situating that in the Asian Pacific context, wherein we have this, perhaps community building, co-mobility with people, but also understanding that there are regimes shaping who is able to move and who is not to move in this what we call digital world. Thank you very much for that presentation, listening.
Thank you very much for both Sukhmani and Erwin for having made these presentations within 15 minutes. And Noor, thank you for coming back. So I'll start off the discussion. So what we'll do is I'll just open up the floor for Q&A after a brief discussion amongst the three presenters. So I was wondering if, Noor, you could comment a little bit, joining us from Singapore, you could comment a little bit on this kinds of connectivity and justice that both Erwin and Sukhmani have talked about. You're working within a very specific context where questions of inclusion, questions of justice are also mediated by national and international concerns. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
Okay. I think I fully agree with you. The way I look at my issue is try to understand the intersectionality between individual need, which is micro, and also meso, which is a societal problem, and also macro one. Because without tackling these three, connection within the three, I won't be effectively successful in helping helping those released terrorists to integrate society and engage them and using their process of living as a tool to engage others, not to follow their path. So yeah, I think I'm very much inspired, especially with Charles' presentation, Dr. Erwin Charles, because I'm also working with a specific cluster of migrant workers or those who get involved in this very particular political violence activity in terms of donations. Well, what Dr. Sukhmani talked inspired me to look at also how a policy of migration and immigration affected some of Indonesian overseas.
Thank you. So, Penny, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. All the three projects that you alluded to, look at lives at stake. You know, some lives are more livable, mournable, but also governable. That there are certain lives that are governed by the nation state in a particular way than not others. So, in this project, in these three projects, have you found ways in which the communities themselves are taking action to affect policy changes? Because it's one thing to have community activism, another thing to have policy actually affected at the government level. So I was wondering if something has emerged from your work that speaks to this.
It's not. I don't think the communities. There's another kind of work coming out of a symposium which is about migrant civic practice in times of crisis, and I think what has emerged during the pandemic is that working class, migrant and refugee communities have been involved in their very specific local levels in terms of tackling food insecurity, vaccine uptakes within particular cohorts where there might be vaccine hesitancy. And that's happened across the world, but it's definitely cases of that happening across diverse areas in Western Sydney as well as in Melbourne. But I can't remember the authors of the paper, but what happened in Flemington and North Melbourne, I think, has been documented because the younger people in those communities had these really extensive networks set up when those towers were in lockdown, where the support, and this speaks to Irvin's paper as well, wasn't just about language and in-language support. It was about using particular networks that were used in those communities to be mediators between the officials and the people on the ground. And so I think that intergenerational communication is an important aspect of these communities, which can then have a lever in terms of affecting public policy. So not to say that young people are the answer to all the problems in the world, but I do think that they do play the role of being a mediator in terms of being able to talk to policymakers, or at least talk back to the dominant discourse, as well as talk to first generation migrants or migrants with particular kinds of communication platform usage or English language difficulties. So what happened in those instances is a good example of what was happening in other communities, which I think there's research that will be published soon from researchers across Australia. But I think more work could be done to understand how it's going beyond the kind of civic action realm to the policy-making realm, which is another gripe of mine, that migrants are often cast as those in need, both during the pandemic and more broadly, and not seen as having agency. So it's only once you're sort of seen as agential beings are you going to be able to sort of make a change at the policy level.
That's a great segue into what I wanted to ask Irvin. Your particular subjects in this study, the people you interviewed, are doubly disadvantaged in terms of agency, in terms of age, as well as in access. So what are the ways that you have found in conversation with them? Are they pushing, do they recognize themselves as a certain constituency that can bring about more mobility and access and mobility justice?
I think during my interviews with the participants, because obviously, just for example, the setup of the interview using a phone call or a Zoom, that's also already revealing the resources. And it was interesting, for example, some of the participants were actually even asking me, Irvin, how do you press this one on Zoom? So I became a digital, assistant for them in that space, but also family members setting up the Zoom background. I had someone from Malaysia. She was very happy. You know what, Irvin, this Zoom background, the temple in Malaysia, it's actually made by my daughter. So you can see the relationship being entangled in those conversations, and even the method of collecting data. But what's interesting about as well during the interviews would be this capacity building within the home. Because I mean, like in Victoria, there's a Good Things Foundation kind of like programs to teach migrants to use technologies. But these are basic assistance for them to learn technologies. But take note that actually migrants or individuals use technologies relationally. If my son doesn't use Zoom, why would I use Zoom? If he's using, for example, which some of my participants will be saying, if they're using Telegram in, in another country, I'll use Telegram in that space. And I think we need to center those conversations when we start thinking about capacity building. For example, some of my participants were saying, actually, Irvin, I couldn't connect to my family in Indonesia or in the Philippines because I don't have the data, financial resource. And sometimes they will be saying, I actually don't have like mobile data that can be used for TikToking, and I couldn't join the prayer because of this not having the data. But they're also trying to navigate the structural barriers in that space by not, for example, switching on the video, just participating in the background. But still, when you think about that, that's exclusion. If you start talking about inclusion, right? So that's an main point in that conversation as well. But also kind of like phone call. We tend to think that phone call is gone for some people, but it actually played a important role during the COVID, the lockdown, because the leaders of migrant communities, which I had, I interviewed them as well. They were telling me, Irvin, we actually call aging migrants every day, just to check on them, how they're doing, because it's relatively cheaper. Rather than, and they don't know how to use Facebook Messenger. Some of them, they didn't know how to use WhatsApp or something like that. They're also afraid of the digital environment because of scamming and fraud. Someone even asked me, Irvin, how do you differentiate a meme and then a scam and then a fraud? And I was like, okay, let me just explain this. I was even challenged during the interview to start explaining that skill to a particular participant. And they were telling me, Irvin, I don't use the mobile apps these days because, I work so hard in Australia. I earn this money. I don't want the scammer to just get this money. And sometimes, for example, they'll be receiving messages saying you actually bought from Amazon, and this participant will say, I haven't actually bought anything from Amazon, and I'm being asked to provide an information. And I think this is important because in terms of Australia, scamming is impacting, and particularly age 55 years old are actually the victims of scamming. They send money back home, and sometimes they don't understand the information in that space. So mobility justice, going back to your question, Maridula, I think it's important to bring in the voices, which was saying a while ago, and then also thinking about community building and capacity building, and have an understanding of how those transnational connections would be shaping the practices in here to access the basic resources for that engagement in various contexts.
Thank you. We now have about 20 minutes for any questions, comments from the audience members. Yes, this young lady here.
So much. Hi, thank you. My name is Anissa from University of Melbourne. Thanks for the speakers, such excellent presentations. And I want to ask Dr. Irwin in particular, and also Dr. Noor. Irwin, I'm really interested in what you said about extractive digital immobility at home, and particularly on your point about exploitation by platform companies, because we are getting into these norms or particular ways of communicating. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the role of the younger members of family. You mentioned it a bit just now, so if you could speak more to that. To familiarizing a particular idea of being mobile in the digital world to the older members of the family, if you could speak a bit more about that. And in relation to that, Dr. Noor, I wonder if you could sort of explore a bit more about what do you mean by integration, because I'm related to Irvin's point on exploitation, surveillance. What does it mean for these ex-terrorists to be participating in this digital world and maybe to be further surveilled by the government? Is that possible?
Thank you very much, Anissa, for that question. So yeah, I actually had participants, and they were talking about their younger family members teaching them to use technologies. And for me, my understanding and also analysis of that, this kind of like co-mobility, like teaching someone to use the technology and be able to move at the same time in that space. So during the interviews, for example, it was interesting. Let me talk about this case study wherein that participant, she's born in the Philippines, around 65 years old. She was living alone. But because of the lockdown, you're not allowed to visit anyone, right? So she told me, Irvin, I'm actually scared because I'm asking my nephews and nieces to fix the modem for me, to fix the things for me. And I'm asking them to actually go not follow the government advice on not visiting family members, because she was like, I don't know how to connect. I feel isolated. I need someone. I couldn't call someone. And when I call, for example, Telstra, they speak English. I don't understand. It's so technical for me. And like if I want someone in person and teaching and assisting me. And I think that's important because not only with the layer of family connections, but also to understand that elderly people are also having issues with cognition, bodily movements, bodily constraints, and even like the processes of getting those information. So hence, the family members were really playing a role in that space. Another participant, if the family member wasn't there in the house, he showed me a black notebook waving me on Zoom. You know what this one, Irvin? These are all the instructions of my son to actually use the printer, the computer, the smartphone. I was so interested. That's interesting. Because when you start talking about co-design, you then bring in the perspective of the person using the platform to design something. And we can bring that in as part of conversation on co-design and community building. And another important part with TikTok, which I mentioned earlier, she learned that through the grandchildren, because for her, it's a form of bonding to at least forget the pandemic and we are actually okay in this space. So the paradox, which my title would be suggesting, is that we are connected. We feel this sense of joy, happiness, calmness. But at the back of those practices would be these tech companies collecting our data, profiling us. And that's the paradox of that. And even the government, I mean, like the conversation now is like, you are collecting my data, you can be racially profiled, and you can be excluded in a particular service or particular action. And then we start thinking about, so what is the government is doing this with this extraction of data? And not only that, tech companies are actually leeching on our emotions. We are sad, we are frustrated, we are afraid. We make connection. And those connections are actually translated to likes, hits, views, and subscriptions. And even for the elderly people, like, dancing or exercising on YouTube, doing all of this prayer meeting on Facebook Messenger. It's important because they're connected. But the question is like, what's happening to the data in that space? And that's creating an immobilizing structural system that the elite benefit from that system, and those who are marginalized can actually be just, temporarily mobile, but not, perhaps permanent, immobile in that environment. And we start thinking about step back. What's happening to extraction of data? Who is benefiting? And how do we build in really the community building that would benefiting communities in that space?
In response to Isaac's question from Melbourne University, I think to answer this one, it's just quick to give you a background. So since 2012, we are seeing the shifting of people joining into violent groups. Before 2014, before the declaration of ISIS, we call it collective actions. Individual join to a specific group first, the Jamaah Islamiyah, Moro Islamic Liberation Group. So group play a very important role. So offline, people join a group for a couple of months and years, then the group mold their identity. So they do some violent activity inspired or shaped by the group dynamic. But in 2014, you are moving the trend from collective action into connective action. So especially during the pandemic, you see spike of people get involved or connected. If I borrow the explanation of Dr. Erwin, so you see the massive mobility to join through the social net, through the digital world. And then my work is grounded within a social psychology the debate called motivated reasoning. People tend to find information that only support their argument. So, and then to challenge that one, I try to incorporate the power of storytelling coming from the credible voice. Those reform terrorists, those terrorists who already renounced to enter a new life, use their story, put in the social media, because I work closely with a number of social media platforms, including Facebook, Google, and even TikTok, to amplify their story coming from this credible voice. This is what I mean. But the meaning of integration here will be because to me, when you look at radicalizations, joining into violence group is not a thing. It is a process. So you see individual before joining, during joining, and after joining. And then reintegration means those who left the network and start new life and be part of the community. And their story, I use it, I explore into storytelling. So I produce film and then content that will be shared and then create conversations. So this is, I hope I can answer the questions. Another question from Saiful, which is, I like it a lot. He said that, okay, my approach, what is the new of my triple H approach? Heart, hand, and head. Yes, I borrow this term into a generic term in education system, but in my subject, in countering violent extremism, or especially things that has been implemented in the regions, most of the policy makers, most of the intervention have obsessed with notion of de-radicalization. So they change their mind first before earning the trust from what I so-called client or targeted audience. So if the existing intervention, they're telling them, oh, what you are doing is against the Quranic message, Islam is religion of peace, rather than earning their trust first. So my new contribution in this debate will be the sequence, if you want to help them to integrate back to society, rather than attacking their ideology first, you need to earn their trust first, give them head, give them a meaningful things, and lastly will be head, not the other way around. This is the things that I've been advocating. So this is my new contributions, I think. And then this is another question from Junie. Based on your experience, I was wondering whether you have any recommendation on what form of communication, how to change the mindset of terrorists or ex-terrorists to be a more moderate understanding of Islam. Oh, this is tough questions, But one thing you have to remember, when people leaving violence network, it doesn't mean that they do not think radical. They do not want to change the secular system of Indonesia. They just, therefore I call it disengage. They only disengage from violence first. So therefore, earning their trust first is important. But how to change them, in my own experience, I call it creating new social environment that provide them a cognitive opening, confront them with reality. In my number of interventions, including the one that I use in Indonesia, is using cafe, right? So where release terrorists working in the cafe. So when in the cafe, they start to engage with so many different type of individuals. They celebrate the difference. They respect each other. And that is first, they start to revisit. And then in a cafe business and hospitality business, you need to respect. And this is something that has been missing within this community of violent extremism. But in a nutshell, there is no one size fits for all to tackle this very issue.
We have time for one more question, and I was wondering if there was one specifically for Sukhmani, if anybody had a burning question. Otherwise, it's open for... Yes.
I'm Ben Haggerty from the University of Melbourne. I had a question that I guess could be addressed by any of you, but especially Sukhmani. I was wondering about the role for gender and sexual justice, or the questions around gender and sexual justice, and whether they might provide, I guess, another analytical lens or series of questions that might help to further that effort. Thinking about many of the kinds of framings of both COVID, but also broader questions of migration. The kind of suburban bloc is certainly kind of a white dream, but it's also a very heteronormative dream. Or stay at home, for instance, has very kind of entrenched, naturalized kinds of relations within it, or who is biological kin that can visit. I was wondering whether your data had any kind of, I guess, alternatives to, the kind of seemingly inescapable kind of heteronormative format presented to migrant communities. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think increasingly there's work in the refugee sphere that I'm more familiar with. There's a lot of work on refugees that don't fit those kind of ideas of, the heteronormative family, and what kind of provisions we have for resettling them and relatives sponsoring other relatives. But in terms of pandemic justice, I think it hasn't been adequately addressed locally, let alone when we are talking about migrants and refugees. The other project that I didn't really speak to is beginning to look at that, because it was looking at starting with South Asian Australian mothers who gave birth during the pandemic, and the kinds of experiences they had institutionally, not just in terms of not being able to have face-to-face appointments, but also of racialized and heteronormative expectations of what a family is and what kind of support might be available. So that work is coming, and thank you for bringing that up so that I can speak to this particular project. More broadly, I think that the gender and kind of sexual diverse sexuality aspects of refugee and migrant communities tend to kind of be, at least in the Western Sydney context, they tend to kind of fly under the radar, although there are organizations, advocacy organizations emerging that you might already be familiar with. I know when the gay marriage debate was taking place, Western Sydney was maligned in particular for having lower rates of the yes vote compared to many other parts of the country. But what was not highlighted was that there were campaigns by conservatives to portray certain communities in a way that may have led them to vote no, which is not me trying to defend those communities, but to kind of point out other factors that might be at play, which undermine the work that many LGBTIQ people from those communities are doing in order to change those and shift those conversations.
Thank you again for coming. The afternoon sessions are all the regional keynotes, so please check the board to see where your particular regional keynote is happening, and thank you again for being here.